You're listening to the Monday Night Community Show with Daniel on BRFM.
This is the Daniel Monday Night Community Show on demand through YouTube. Thank you very much for choosing to listen to us through this method. If you'd like to keep up to date with when I add new interviews, then subscribe to this channel.
We present The Interview by John Fryer, read by Dan Carroll Corley.
"Do you have your trading forecast and profit and loss account with you?" asked Robert Leonard, assistant manager at the United National Bank. The branch was situated squarely at the centre, right-hand side of the town's high street, giving it a presence and grandeur that Robert felt was somewhat unearned. The building had started life as a 19th century church. Its ornate sculpture of gargoyles and dragons had lost something of their fierceness over the last 100 years or so, due to pollution, weathering and general age, but they were still noticeable to anyone that bothered to glance up when entering the bank. Few, of course, ever did. The irony of a church being turned into a high street bank was not lost on Robert. It wasn't that he was religious, for indeed he had long since turned away from organised faith, or disorganised spirituality, as a friend had once called it. But he did recall one lesson about the Bible from school. Jesus had called the moneylenders in the synagogues a den of thieves. Now the den of thieves had simply taken up residence in what had once been the house of God. Taking the paperwork from the young couple that sat opposite him, Robert looked down the list of running costs and calculations that would be required to keep the proposed business afloat. The printout before him was from two people who clearly did give a damn, and they did want to change the world. It was his job to see how feasible their idea actually was. Robert had sat in the bank's small interview room many times looking over such pieces of paper. It was that determination he had to make, their costing he was now considering. Robert raised his eyes from the figures before him, keeping his head down as if scrutinising not only their numbers, but also their very reactions. "And how did you come by these numbers?" he asked. In truth, the printed trading forecast meant nothing to him. He was required to go through this performance several times a week, pretending that he could see errors in the projected sales that mere mortals would miss. After 5 years at the branch, he felt he knew why the bank lent out money, and the quality of the business plan really wasn't it. 2006 was slowly turning out to be terribly similar to the previous 5 years, and Robert was starting to think not only that there must be more to life than watching other people follow their hopes and aspirations, but that the very process of his chosen profession was now starting to have a detrimental effect on the world around him. Although on the surface life was fine, Robert knew that there was a problem. A big problem. He had started to become aware of the fact that the housing market had begun to soar into the stratosphere, with properties acquiring a value that seemed unjustifiable under any explanation. The purchasing of a second, third, fourth, or even more houses in which the only collateral was the proposed owner's word appeared to him nonsensical. Somewhere, something in the system was very, very wrong. Each morning he had found himself staring at the man in the shaving mirror, wondering when and if he should raise the subject at work. But bonuses were up on last year, and looking pretty good for this year, and as everyone was doing all right, why rock the boat? Would anyone thank him if he did? He was sure he knew the answer to that one. So he found himself each morning putting on his suit, grabbing the car keys, closing the front door, and going back to work. But somewhere he knew. He was sure they all knew. It was the doing nothing about it that was starting to eat away at him. He refocused on the matter at hand. The brown-haired youth, well, not really a youth, but Robert judged in his early 20s, coughed a little and shifted in his leather-bound upright chair. Robert often wondered if the chair was only there to force those asking for money to remain facing their inquisitor. There'd be nowhere else to turn to. Stephen Arnold cleared his throat. "Those are the figures based on the industry standard," he uttered. Robert tried not to smile at the young man's unease. It would be callous to lord it over the two of them. Ask them questions about cost ratios and sales expectations. How long could you continue without any income? Did they have a fallback, a second idea if the first one didn't work as they expected or hoped, and on and on? He had seen others do it, verbally kicking those already down on their knees. Lowering his face once more to the desk, he fought the desire to comment. That's the deals the big fish have negotiated for themselves. The little fish, they have to have something else. Chloe, the blonde, pretty half of the business arrangement that sat before him, leaned forward. We already have interest from 5 stores that have agreed to take our product, and we have a meeting with Bolton's this afternoon at 3. So don't waste our time, Robert thought as he continued his forensic examination of the spreadsheet before him. I'm sure you'll be away from here by then, he assured them in a neutral, non-committal tone. And then next week we are talking to a courier company about distribution, Chloe added, a bit sheepishly. Robert's raised eyeline stopped her from continuing. She had at first sounded strong and sure-footed. Now the desperation was creeping into her voice, her carefully prepared words giving way to revealing her need for the proposed loan. Your first year's projected income seems... Robert left the unfinished sentence hanging in the air, the suggested disapproval creating an atmosphere. He could feel both Steve and Chloe slightly leaning forward, their bodies coming away from the backs of their chairs. Seems... What? Chloe asked. Robert noticed her voice raised an octave as he had asked the question. He replied, starting to enjoy the moment. Steve swallowed hard. Robert sensed the young man raise his hand to his mouth, then recovered and transformed the gesture into an apparent scratch on the side of his head. It just looks as if you've been a little unambitious in your calculations, Robert continued, keeping his voice quiet and controlled. Unambitious? Inquired Chloe, clearly wondering where she and Steve may have gone wrong. Your sales figures in the current climate. Again, Robert left the hinted failure hanging over their heads. We've tried to be realistic, jumped in Steve, a slight tick developing over his right eye. It's a competitive market at the moment, added Chloe. We thought it best to be conservative in our approach, to hope for the best. But plan for it all going down the plug hole? Continued Robert, running the tip of his index finger down the column of neatly presented numbers. You have to consider it, said Chloe, suddenly crossing her legs. Was that an act of nervousness? Or was she trying to distract him from the pages of facts and figures presented? Robert wasn't sure. Chloe was certainly beautiful, and her dark blue business suit of jacket and skirt did give her an air of efficiency and drive that Robert expected. But if even the suggestion of criticism produced this sort of reaction, what would they do under the full pressure of running their own company? Robert put the thought out of his mind. It wasn't going to be his problem. If they paid back the loan, or were unable to, he would have no sleepless nights either way. Robert raised his head, sitting back in his chair and interlocking his fingers, the knuckles making a curved ridge over which he now looked squarely at the pair before him, resting his elbows on the chair's arms. And what do you have as security? He asked, the killer question. Good ideas were one thing. A good idea was definitely needed, the thing upon which the whole idea worked. But the guaranteed return of money was how the bank worked, and he couldn't let them forget that. Steve gulped loudly again, rubbing the sweat off the palms of his hands. I have a 2-bedroom flat, he replied, and then added, My parents bought it for me. Steve's eyes were suddenly downcast. Robert assumed this might have been the first time the full enormity of the loan had hit him. What was on paper could very soon be a reality. He wondered if Steve was secretly hoping to be turned down. Well, smiled Robert, closing the business plan. Let us hope it never comes to that. Yes, answered Steve. Another swallow, eyes now on the offer's deep red shag pile carpet. Robert let the silence last for a moment, and then decided to put the pair out of their agony. "This looks fine. I'll just make a photocopy of your paperwork and get the okay from the manager." He smiled at them both, stood up pushing his legs straight, moving his own chair away from the desk just enough for him to step out from around the back and leave the room. "I don't know," said Robert, standing in the bank's rear office corridor, the fluorescent strip lighting burning just above his head. "They seem competent enough, and their business plan looks okay." "Then what's the problem, Robert?" asked the large burly man who was the final definitive voice of authority as far as the branch was concerned, Mr. Arthur Jenkins. "There's a lot of debt in the system. The market's pretty hot at the moment, and the bubble can't be far from popping." Mr. Jenkins was one of those men that even after knowing him for 5 years, Robert was still required to refer to him as Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins folded his arms. "Do they have any security?" he asked. "They're home," replied Robert with a sigh. "Give them the money then," said Mr. Jenkins, starting to turn and leave, the short discussion over. "And if there is a recession?" asked Robert, knowing the answer in advance. Mr. Jenkins slipped his hands into his pockets, a smile developing at the side of his mouth. "That's why we ask for some security." Robert decided to try a different approach. "They already have contracts with several stores in this town." "That's great. Authorize the facility," replied the manager, slowly rocking forward and back on the toes and heels of his shoes. 3 of the owners of these stores have been in to see me in the last month to ask for extensions on their repayment deadlines. I think they'll go to the wall within the next 12 months. A pause. "Go on," said Mr. Jenkins after the long moment's silence. "If we back this enterprise, authorizing this loan, there's a very good chance they'll simply follow these stores onto the breadline." Mr. Jenkins withdrew his hands from his pockets, folding them once again across his chest. "Then we'll get their property to resell, won't we? After all, Robert, it's only through the issuing of loans, at rates of interest, that we ever make any money. Get it done!" "I'm sorry," Robert said, shoulders slumped, palms raised up in an apologetic gesture of regret. "The manager, he won't go for it. In the current climate—" "What?" asked Chloe, almost choking with disappointment. "He believes this is the wrong time for such a venture as this." "I want to see him," squawked Chloe, her makeup unable to hide the crimson shade now flushing her cheeks. "It will make no difference, I'm afraid," Robert continued. "It's sadly out of my hands." Steve and Chloe looked at Robert. "If that's your attitude," Chloe responded after a moment's silence, standing up from her chair and storming towards the door. "Come on, Steve, we'll try somewhere else." Slowly, Steve got to his feet. "Why?" he asked quietly. Robert thought for a moment. How someone uses their knowledge determines the kind of person they are, Steve. Some will use it to drop you in the mire, some to keep you out of that dark place you may have been heading towards. Steve slowly nodded his head. "You'd better take that pen out of Chloe's hand before she signs on the dotted line. She won't take this well," said Steve. "Just remind her," Robert answered. "You may never recognize your true friends, but try to recognize your enemies." Steve gave him a quizzical look. Robert placed his hands in his pockets. "The real enemy is the one that lets you crucify yourself, while your true friend stops you from getting your heart's desire. Have a good day." Steve stepped out of the office. Robert closed the door behind him. For a moment, he stood still, enjoying the only sound, that of the fan in the wall, keeping the room cool. he smiled to himself. Tonight, he would have no trouble seeing himself in the shaving mirror.
The interview was read by Dan Carroll Corley and written and directed by John Fryer. The interview is an audio production for Political Art.